So to calculate the velocity, we need to know how far it's moved since the last update. And in order to do that, we need to save where it was in the last update so we can compare the values. So we're going to go to the variable section, again, under my blueprint. Click the plus icon to add a new variable. And we're going to set this to a transform. And we're going to rename this variable to previous world location. And I'm actually going to call it previous world transform because it also contains the information about the rotation and scale. But we won't be using those for now, but previous world transform makes more sense. So then compile and save. And what we need to do is we need to set this value. And we're going to set it every frame. So every time this function calculate velocity is called, we're going to save the previous world transform to whatever the current is. So we'll drag in this variable and click set previous world transform. Connect that up in the execution path. And the value we're going to set this to is going to be wherever this character is. So in rig space, we're going to get the transform in rig space, which is the center of the character, or the 0, 0, 0 in rig space. And then we're going to convert it to a world location. So we'd essentially get where is this rig in world space. And remember that world space is where they are in the actual level. So what we want to do is get the transform of the rig. So that's just going to be 0, 0, 0 according to rig space, and then convert it to a world transform. So the way we can do this is we can just right click anywhere and search for to world. And this is taking any input and converting it from rig space to world space. So if we connect this world output to our transform, this has now converted the input to a transform. So it's expecting a transform to be input with rotation, translation, and scale. However, if we don't enter anything into these, it will just use 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, and the scale is irrelevant. So what that will do is basically take the rig space with no offset whatsoever, and then convert that into a world space. So we're essentially finding out where is this rig relative to the world. So this is all we need to do to save the previous world transform. And I'm going to move this to the right because we want to save this variable at the end of whatever we do here. And that's because it doesn't want to use this value in the calculation. It wants to use the previous value from the frame before when we saved it last time. So we'll keep these to the right. Now what we want to do is calculate how far the character has moved since the last frame, so the last previous world transform. So to compare that, we want to do, once again, right click and search for to world. And remember, this is taking no input. So it's just calculating where the rig is in the world, as it does here. But what we're going to do now is we're going to drag and create a multiply node. So just search for multiply. And this is going to be a transform multiplication. And what we want to multiply it with is the previous world transform. So we can drag that in and click get. But we don't want to use this directly. We want to get the inverse of this because we're trying to find the difference between this and this. So we want to multiply it by the inverse of this variable, which is essentially going to find us the difference between where it is now compared to where it was previously. So we're going to drag out from the value of the previous world transform and search for inverse and click on inverse. So we're going to plug the result into B. And remember, this is non-commutative, so the order matters. So it needs to be the current world transform, so from 0, 0, 0 converted to the world, and then multiplied by the inverse of the previous world transform. And this should give us the difference between where it is now from where it was in the previous frame. So before we go changing this previous world transform and affecting this calculation, we want to save this value. So to do that, we're going to create a new variable. And I'm going to call this world delta. So essentially, how far has the world moved since the last update? So we're going, and this is set to a transform, and we're going to click and drag that in and choose set world delta. Connect that up to the execution path. And we're going to plug this result into the value and compile and save. So now this should be telling us how far the world has moved since the last update. And in the next section, we're going to just test this and make sure it's calculating how far the character has moved.